What just happened between a Trump official and Mark Carney is one of the most revealing moments we've seen from this administration, and honestly, it tells you everything you need to know about how they operate when they get caught. Scott Bessent, Trump's Treasury Secretary, went on national television and told a flat-out lie about the Canadian Prime Minister. When Carney exposed that lie the very next day, standing in front of cameras and basically calling Bessent a liar without using those exact words, you'd think there would be some kind of damage control, right? Maybe a clarification, a statement saying there was a misunderstanding, something. Instead, Bessent went right back on TV and launched a series of personal attacks so petty, so desperate, that even seasoned diplomats are saying this signals something deeper is going on with Trump's inner circle. This isn't normal diplomatic behavior. This is panic dressed up as bravado, and we need to talk about what it really means. Let's start with what actually happened here, because the timeline matters. On January 20th, Mark Carney delivered what's already being called one of the most consequential speeches by a Canadian leader in decades at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. He stood up in front of the global elite and basically said the quiet part out loud. The American-led world order, it's over. The rules-based system everyone keeps invoking, it's dead. Great powers are now weaponizing trade and using economic coercion as their primary tool, and middle powers like Canada need to stop pretending everything's fine and start banding together for survival. He quoted Václav Havel, the Czech dissident who became president, talking about living in truth versus living in lies. The speech received a rare standing ovation. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte called it evidence that Canada is back as a global leader. Finland's president said it was one of the best speeches of the week. This wasn't some fringe criticism. This was Canada's leader standing on the world stage and saying what a lot of countries have been thinking but haven't had the courage to say. Trump, predictably, did not take this well. He watched the speech and went on the attack, calling Canada ungrateful for all the freebies they supposedly get from America. He rescinded Canada's invitation to his Board of Peace, whatever that is. Then over the weekend, he threatened to impose 100% tariffs on Canadian goods if Ottawa strikes a trade deal with China. We're talking about potentially doubling the cost of Canadian imports overnight. This is economic warfare as a threat, exactly what Carney was talking about in his speech. The irony was apparently lost on Trump. So Monday rolls around, January 26th, and Trump calls Carney. They have a 30-minute conversation. According to Carney, they discussed Ukraine, Venezuela, Arctic security, and Canada's new trade partnerships. Carney says he told Trump about the 12 new trade deals Canada is pursuing on 4 continents, and that Trump was actually impressed. It was, by Carney's account, a very good conversation covering a wide range of subjects. That was Monday during the day. Monday night, Scott Bessent goes on Fox News. Hannity's show naturally, because where else would you go to spin a narrative? And Bessent tells the American people something very specific. He says he was in the Oval Office with the president during the call. He says that Carney was very aggressively walking back some of the unfortunate remarks he made at Davos. Very aggressively walking back. Those were his exact words. The implication was crystal clear. Carney had stood up at Davos, criticized American power, gotten a standing ovation, but then when Trump called him, he supposedly folded like a cheap suit and took it all back. Bessent was painting a picture of Carney as someone who talks tough on the world stage but then grovels in private when the big, powerful American president picks up the phone. Except there was one problem with this story. It wasn't true. And Carney knew it wasn't true because he was the one actually on the phone call. Tuesday morning, January 27th, Carney arrives at Parliament Hill for a cabinet meeting. Reporters are waiting for him, obviously, because Bessent's claim on Fox News was major news, and Carney doesn't hedge. He doesn't use diplomatic language. He doesn't say, well, there may have been some misunderstanding. He looks directly at the cameras and says, to be absolutely clear, and I said this to the president, I meant what I said in Davos. When asked specifically if he walked back his comments, Carney says no, just no, flat denial. He even rolled his eyes when the question was asked, which honestly, what a power move. According to reports, Carney literally rolled his eyes at the suggestion that he'd backtracked. He confirmed the call happened, confirmed they discussed multiple topics, and made it abundantly clear that not only did he not walk anything back, but he told Trump directly during the call that he meant every word of his Davos speech. So now we have a situation. The Treasury Secretary of the United States went on national television and claimed something happened that the Prime Minister of Canada is now publicly saying did not happen. One of them is lying. And given that Carney was actually on the call, and Bessent was at best listening in, probably taking notes, it seems pretty clear who's telling the truth here. Multiple news outlets picked up on this discrepancy immediately. The New Republic ran with the headline that Canada's Carney says Trump team is lying about their call after Davos. CNN covered it. CBC covered it extensively. Bloomberg covered it. This wasn't some minor disagreement that got lost in the news cycle. This was an international incident where the Treasury Secretary got caught spreading what appears to be a deliberate falsehood about a conversation with a foreign leader. Now here's where it gets really interesting. When a government official gets caught like this, there's a standard playbook. You issue a clarification. You say there was a miscommunication. You walk it back yourself, ironically enough. You move on and try to minimize the damage. That's what professional administrations do. That's what people with media training do. That's what anyone with even a basic understanding of international relations does. But that's not what Scott Bessent did. Instead, on Wednesday, January 28th, less than 24 hours after Carney exposed his lie, Bessent went right back on television. This time, CNBC's Squawk on the Street with Sarah Eisen. And instead of correcting the record, instead of apologizing, instead of showing even a shred of accountability, he went on the attack. Personal attacks. Nasty ones. First, he accused Carney of virtue signaling to his globalist friends at Davos. Virtue signaling. That's the phrase you use when you want to dismiss someone's principles as performative without actually addressing what they said. It's a rhetorical trick, and not even a good one. Carney gave a speech about the collapse of the international order and the need for middle powers to band together for survival, backed up by concrete policy actions Canada is actually taking. And Bessent's response is to call it virtue signaling. That's not a rebuttal, that's an insult. Then he warned Carney not to pick a fight going into the USMCA negotiations. The trade agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada is up for review this year, and Bessent is trying to frame Carney's speech as picking a fight. But here's the thing. Carney gave that speech before Trump started threatening 100% tariffs. Carney gave that speech about economic coercion, and then Trump immediately proved his point by threatening economic coercion. Who's picking the fight here exactly? Bessent also said that Carney is either working for his own political career or working for the Canadian people, implying he can't be doing both. That's a cheap shot. Every politician works for their political career. That's how democracy functions. The question is whether they're also delivering for their constituents, and Carney is currently pursuing 12 new trade deals to diversify Canada's economy away from overdependence on the United States. That's literally working for the Canadian people. That's his job. But here's the most revealing attack. Bessent said, and I'm quoting here, "In my investment career, I've seen what happens when a technocrat tries to pivot and become a politician. It never really works out well." This is a personal jab at Carney's background. Carney was the governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013. Then he was the governor of the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020. He's considered one of the most respected central bankers in the world. He helped steer both countries through the financial crisis and its aftermath. And Bessent, who made his fortune in hedge funds, is trying to diminish that by calling him a technocrat who doesn't understand politics. It's condescending, it's dismissive, and it completely ignores the fact that Carney just won an election and is currently the sitting Prime Minister of Canada. Whether you like his policies or not, he clearly figured out the politics well enough to win. Bessent also claimed that Carney rose to power on an anti-American, anti-Trump message. This is interesting because it's trying to delegitimize Carney's entire position by framing him as fundamentally hostile to the United States. But that's not what Carney ran on. Carney ran on building Canadian sovereignty and diversifying the economy. Those aren't anti-American positions. Those are pro-Canada positions. And if Bessent can't tell the difference between a country pursuing its own interests and being anti-American, that tells you a lot about how the Trump administration views alliances. They apparently think allies should just do whatever America wants, and if you don't, you're anti-American. That's not how alliances work. That's how subordination works, which is exactly what Carney was warning about in his Davos speech. Let's talk about what this reveals about the Trump administration's mindset, because this is where it gets psychologically interesting. Bessent didn't have to lie about the phone call in the first place. If Carney had actually walked back his comments, that would have been real news. Trump could have leveraged it. But that's not what happened. So why did Bessent go on Fox News and claim it did? Multiple analysts have pointed out that Bessent was likely trying to save Trump's dignity. Trump was humiliated by Carney's speech. It got a standing ovation at Davos, while Trump's own speech the next day was largely panned. Carney upstaged him on the world stage, and Trump can't stand being upstaged. So Bessent, loyal soldier that he is, went on friendly media and tried to spin a narrative where Trump had won the exchange. Carney might have talked tough publicly, but he folded privately. That's the story Bessent wanted Americans to believe. But then Carney called him out, publicly, unambiguously. And now Bessent had a choice. He could admit he mischaracterized the call, which would make him look bad and make Trump look bad. Or he could double down and attack Carney's character, hoping that turning it personal would muddy the waters enough that people would forget about the original lie. He chose option 2. That's revealing. It shows a pattern of behavior where accountability is not an option. When caught in a falsehood, the response is not correction but escalation, not apology but attack. This is Trump administration crisis management 101, and we've seen it play out dozens of times before on domestic issues. Now we're seeing it applied to international diplomacy, and the fact that Bessent felt comfortable doing this with a close ally tells you how normalized this behavior has become. Former diplomats are watching this situation with genuine alarm. Senator Peter Boehm, who served as Canada's ambassador to Germany and has decades of foreign service experience, said that Carney's Davos speech was the most consequential by a Canadian prime minister in decades. Louise Blais, another former Canadian diplomat, said the speech puts Canada at the center of global middle powers as they grapple with a changing world. But multiple diplomatic experts have also noted that Bessent's response, particularly the personal attacks after being caught in a mischaracterization, signals desperation. This is not how confident superpowers behave. This is how declining powers behave when they feel their control slipping. Think about what Carney actually said in his speech. He talked about how middle powers negotiate from weakness when they deal with hegemons bilaterally. When you're alone at the table with a much larger power, you take what's offered. You compete with other middle powers to be the most accommodating. That's not sovereignty, Carney said. That's the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination. And his solution? Middle powers need to band together. They need to build coalitions. They need to publicly call out economic coercion, even when it comes from an ally. Because if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. That phrase, "you're on the menu," has already become a rallying cry for countries looking to resist American pressure. Finland, France, several other European nations have made statements echoing Carney's themes. There's a real movement building here. And the Trump administration is panicking about it. They should be, because if middle powers actually do band together, if they create alternative trade networks, if they start publicly condemning American economic bullying, that fundamentally changes the geopolitical calculus. America has been able to act as a hegemon precisely because other countries have been willing to compete with each other for American favor, divide and conquer. But if Canada successfully leads a coalition of middle powers who stop competing and start cooperating, that's a different ballgame. Suddenly, America can't play countries off against each other. Suddenly there are alternative markets and alternative partnerships that don't flow through Washington. Suddenly the leverage shifts. Bessent's attacks on Carney aren't really about Carney. They're about trying to discredit this movement before it gains too much momentum. Call it virtue signaling. Frame it as anti-American. Make it personal. Anything to prevent other countries from looking at Canada and thinking, yeah, maybe we should stop pretending the old rules still apply. Maybe we should build our own coalitions. That's what Bessent is trying to prevent. And the fact that he's resorting to personal attacks after getting caught in a lie suggests he doesn't have better ammunition. If there were substantive policy arguments against what Carney is doing, Bessent would be making them. Instead, he's attacking Carney's character and career transition. Meanwhile, Carney is handling this with remarkable composure. He hasn't taken the bait. He hasn't responded to the personal attacks. He's just calmly restating facts. I meant what I said. We're pursuing 12 new trade deals. We had a good conversation with the president. He's refusing to get pulled into a mudslinging match. And that's probably driving Trump and Bessent crazy, because it means Carney gets to stay on message about the substance of his policy while they're stuck looking petty. Former diplomats have noted that Carney's calm handling of this situation has actually intensified the backlash against Bessent because it makes the contrast so stark. You have Carney, measured and consistent, versus Bessent, caught in a lie and lashing out. Who looks more like a statesman? There's also a broader context here about truth and credibility in international relations. When the Treasury Secretary of the United States goes on television and misrepresents a phone call with a foreign leader, that has consequences. Other countries are watching. If Bessent is willing to lie about what Carney said, what else is he lying about? When he talks about trade negotiations with other countries, can they trust his characterization of those conversations? This undermines American credibility globally, and the Trump administration doesn't seem to care. They're operating on the assumption that power matters more than credibility, that as long as America is economically and militarily dominant, the truth is whatever they say it is. But that's a short-term strategy. Over time, if nobody trusts American officials to accurately represent conversations, other countries will simply stop having those conversations. They'll work around the United States instead of with it, which is exactly what Carney is trying to organize. Let's talk about the timing of all this. The USMCA, the trade agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, comes up for mandatory review in 2026. That's this year. Formal negotiations are expected to begin in the next few weeks. Trump has already said he doesn't really care about the agreement. Bessent is using the upcoming negotiations as leverage, essentially threatening that if Carney doesn't fall in line, Canada will face consequences at the negotiating table. But here's the problem with that strategy. Canada is literally in the process of signing 12 new trade deals with partners on 4 continents. Carney has been to China, he's planning trips to India and Australia, he's building alternative trade networks as fast as he can. The threat of a bad USMCA deal only works if Canada has no other options. Carney is creating other options. That's the whole point. He's reducing Canada's vulnerability to exactly this kind of economic coercion. And Trump knows this, which is why he threatened 100% tariffs over the weekend when Canada signed a limited trade deal with China. That's not the action of someone who's confident in their leverage. That's the action of someone who's worried their losing control. Canada reducing its tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% to 6.1% in exchange for China lowering tariffs on Canadian agricultural products is a relatively modest deal. It's not a comprehensive free trade agreement, but Trump reacted like Canada had declared independence. 100% tariffs? That would devastate cross-border trade. It would hurt American companies that rely on Canadian inputs for manufacturing. It would spike prices for American consumers. It's an insane threat, but Trump made it anyway because the psychological impact of Canada turning to China, even modestly, is unbearable to him. It undermines his narrative of American indispensability. This is also happening against the backdrop of Trump's Greenland obsession. He's been pressuring Denmark to sell Greenland to the United States, threatening tariffs against European countries if they don't support his demands. He's talked about making Canada the 51st state. He posted an altered map on social media showing Canada, Greenland, Venezuela, and Cuba as part of American territory. This is not normal diplomatic behavior. This is expansionist rhetoric, and it's freaking out American allies. NATO is on edge. European leaders are having conversations about strategic autonomy that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. And Carney's Davos speech crystallized all of that anxiety into a coherent alternative vision. Stop pretending the old order still exists. Build new coalitions. Resist coercion. That message is resonating because countries are genuinely afraid of what an unchecked America under Trump might do. The domestic Canadian reaction to all this has been fascinating too. Carney's speech has strong support across the political spectrum in Canada. Even his political opponents praised the speech, though some conservatives argued he should be directing similar criticism at China. But the basic premise that Canada needs to reduce its dependence on the United States and build up its own sovereignty, that's not a partisan issue in Canada right now. That's a national consensus. Bessent calling Carney anti-American actually strengthens Carney domestically, because Canadians don't want a prime minister who just rolls over for American demands. They want a prime minister who stands up for Canadian interests. Bessent might think he's damaging Carney, but he's actually handing him a political gift. There's also been interesting commentary from investment and business communities. Some American industries are worried about USMCA renegotiations precisely because they benefit enormously from the current agreement. Auto manufacturers, agricultural exporters, energy companies, they all have integrated supply chains that cross the border multiple times during production. Messing with that to score political points could cause serious economic damage. Bessent is supposed to be the voice of economic rationality in the Trump administration, the guy who understands markets and trade. But his behavior this week suggests he's more interested in political warfare than economic stability. That's concerning for business leaders who were hoping the Treasury Secretary would be a moderating influence. Looking at Bessent's actual record, he made his money in hedge funds, including working for George Soros. He's a financier, not a diplomat, and it shows. He doesn't have the training or temperament for this kind of high-stakes international communication. He's treating Carney like a political opponent in a campaign, going for character attacks and sound bites, rather than like the leader of a sovereign nation and close American ally. That's a category error. It's the wrong playbook for the situation, and it's creating diplomatic fallout that could take years to repair. One point that hasn't gotten enough attention is how this affects other countries' perception of American leadership. If you're a middle power watching this situation, what do you learn? You learn that if you criticize American policy, even diplomatically, the U.S. Treasury Secretary might go on television and lie about your private conversations. And when you call out that lie instead of apologizing, he'll attack you personally. That's not an environment that encourages open dialogue. That's an environment that encourages countries to say whatever Americans want to hear publicly while privately building alternative partnerships. It's an environment that breeds distrust. And in international relations, distrust is incredibly expensive. It means every negotiation takes longer, every agreement needs more verification, every commitment is suspect. The Trump administration is creating massive transaction costs in America's relationships with its allies, and they don't seem to realize it. The chess game here is also interesting. Carney needs to maintain credibility with the coalition of middle powers he's trying to build. If he'd backed down when Bessent mischaracterized their call, that would have made him look weak to potential partners. Countries like France, Finland, India, they're watching to see if Carney actually has the backbone to stand up to American pressure. By immediately and unambiguously contradicting Bessent, Carney signaled that he's not going to fold. That's important for his strategy. But it also means the conflict is now more entrenched. Trump and Bessent can't easily walk this back without looking like they lost. Carney can't walk it back without undermining his whole middle powers initiative. So we're likely in for an extended period of tension. What's the endgame here? That's the big question. For Carney, the endgame is Canada successfully diversifying its economy so that it's no longer 75% dependent on American trade. He wants to get that down to maybe 50% or even lower, with the difference made up by new partnerships in Asia, Europe, and Latin America. That would give Canada genuine negotiating leverage with the United States because the threat of tariffs would hurt Canada less if they have alternative markets. For Trump and Bessent, the endgame seems to be forcing Canada back into line, making sure they understand that defying America has consequences. But they're undermining their own goal. Every threat, every personal attack, every mischaracterization pushes Canada and other countries to accelerate their efforts to reduce dependence on the United States. They're creating the very outcome they're trying to prevent. There's something almost tragic about watching an empire hasten its own decline. The United States still has enormous economic and military power. It could maintain its position as first among equals in a coalition of democracies. But that would require treating allies as partners, not subordinates. It would require listening to legitimate grievances instead of punishing anyone who speaks up. It would require valuing credibility and trust as strategic assets. The Trump administration is doing the opposite. They're treating allies as vassals, punishing dissent, and treating truth as negotiable. And they're confused about why countries are looking for alternatives. Bessent's attacks on Carney will probably play well with Trump's base. They'll see it as standing up to foreign critics and defending American interests. But to everyone else, including the American business community that depends on stable international relationships, this looks like unforced error after unforced error. You don't lie about phone calls with allied leaders. You definitely don't double down with personal attacks when you get caught. These are basic rules of international engagement, and the Treasury Secretary is breaking them repeatedly. The fact that nobody in the White House seems to think this is a problem tells you how far norms have degraded. So where does this leave us? We have Canada's Prime Minister building a coalition of middle powers to resist American economic coercion. We have the U.S. Treasury Secretary lying about phone calls and launching personal attacks when caught. We have upcoming trade negotiations that are going to be extremely contentious. We have Trump threatening impossible tariffs while simultaneously claiming he doesn't care about existing trade agreements. And we have other countries watching all of this, taking notes, and increasingly deciding that their best bet is to hedge against American unpredictability by building alternative partnerships. The international order isn't just changing, it's fracturing. And what we're watching play out between Bessent and Carney is a microcosm of that larger fracture. One side trying to maintain hegemony through coercion and intimidation, the other side trying to build coalitions and alternatives. And nobody really knows how this resolves except that the status quo is over. Carney said that in Davos. Bessent's behavior this week just proved his point.